you can see that it's higher in hypopic patient. It's always larger than 1. In this case, the hypopic, this patient has to accommodate 23% more compared with an amateur. So therefore, in terms of the visual comfort, okay, for the myopic patient, they would prefer to have without correction. So that means uncorrected. Remember, if it is uncorrected, so they can use the uncorrected myopia to compensate for the accommodation. So they don't need to accommodate that much without the correction in the uncorrected stage. And then followed by the spectacle, and then with contact lens. Contact lens would be the worst situation in this case because they have to accommodate the most. For hypopic patient is the opposite. So contact lens will be the best, and then with spectacle lens, okay, then they have to accommodate more. And if they are not being corrected, so it will be even worse because then they have to compensate for the distant prescriptions by using extra accommodation. Okay, so in terms of visual comfort would be the worst. Okay, the best with contact lens for hypopic patient. So far, we have done the ocular accommodation calculation. There is another term. It's called the spectacle accommodation. Okay. The ocular accommodations consider the patient's refractive error and consider the other factor as well. So that's why it will be quite unique for people who have different refractive error. Okay. But for here, for spectacle accommodation is a lot more simple because they will only consider the amounts of the accommodations required as measured by the spectacle plane. So even though you have different amounts of refractive error, so they won't be taken into consideration. Okay. So let me give you one example here. Okay. So this is a spectacle plane S at a distance D in front of the eye. This is the principal plane of the eye. So this is the object distance LC from the eye. So if you use the spectacle accommodation AS, so it will be equal to LC pi minus LC pi. It's just like the other example. Okay, but remember you have to consider this as well. I mean, depending on the question asked, okay, you have to determine whether the distance is talking about the distance from the spectacle lens or distance from the eye. Okay? Let me give you one example here. Okay, so here we just want you to calculate the spectacle accommodation required to see objects clear at 26 centimeter in front of the eye. So assuming that the vertex distance is 10 mm. So now you can see that the objects is located at a distance 26 centimeter in front of the eye, and not in front of the lens. Okay, and then you have to, and then assuming that the vertex distance is 1 centimeter. So therefore, so the image, the information given is D is equal to 1 centimeter. LC should be 0.25 negative, because you have to consider this 1 centimeter from the distance here. Distance is talking about the distance from the objects to the eye. So you have to take that into consideration. So therefore, instead of 26 centimeter, so LC is just 25 centimeter in front of the eye. And based on this calculation, so the spectacle accommodation is equal to, in this case, is about 4 diopter. Okay, so now in this example, so you can see that we did not consider the patient's refractive error. So the spectacle accommodation is the same for people who have different amounts of refractive error, regardless of whether they have myopia, hyperopia, or astigmatism. So it would be the same for all patients. Okay, but of course, in a real situation, when you have different amounts of refractive error, so you can imagine that the calculation is more complicated. And as you learned from the last discussion, so the accommodations required depends primarily on the vertex distance, one thing, so that when you prescribe your spectacle, you need to be careful, because just by changing the vertex distance, it will also change the other parameters as well. Okay, particularly for the high people with high myopia or hyperopia, so the impact is even larger for them. Okay, So the vertex distance is one thing. The second is the patient's the refractive error, okay, the own refractive error. If you have a higher refractive error, high myopia, it might be good for patients who are using spec, because then they may accommodate less compared with wearing contact lens. But for people who are hyperopic, so it would be the opposite. But in this case, you don't have to worry about the ocular part. So you just have to consider the distance from the spectacle plane to the objects, so which is about 4 diopter. So okay, so I have covered all the information here in the accommodation, and I'll see if you have any questions. So if not, as I mentioned earlier, so tomorrow we will have tutorial start at 1:30. So we will do some calculation together on the optometer, followed by depending on the progress, we may spend less than an hour for the tutorial, and then we can and then start the lab session right after the tutorial. So the lab would be on the heterophoria. So I will show you some video and introduce some of the basic concept how we can measure the heterophoria. And if you have any question, you can also ask me tomorrow as well. And we'll have lab tutor stand by, and so they will also answer some of your questions if you have any. Okay. So so I will see you tomorrow. Okay. Bye bye.